Welcome to episode 5 of The Evidence Room. Inside every investigation, the truth is hidden in the evidence. Tonight, we explore one of Canada's most haunting, unsolved mysteries.
And it's one that really challenges everything you think you know about how crimes get solved.
Right, because, usually imagine a scenario where a prolific serial killer is finally caught, tried, and put securely behind bars. The nightmare should be over.
I definitely think so, yeah.
But what happens when you lock up a monster and the disappearances on that exact same stretch of road just continue?
Which is exactly what we're looking into for this deep dive.
Exactly. Tonight, we are traveling to a 719-kilometer stretch of road in British Columbia. It's Highway 16, connecting Prince George to Prince Rupert. And, if you've never been there, you really need to picture the sheer scale of this environment. It is oppressively isolated.
Oh, absolutely. The geography it's a major factor here.
You are surrounded by these towering, incredibly dense pine forests that, honestly, they literally seem to swallow the daylight. And for much of the year, the cold is absolutely biting.
Yeah, and it's a place of just jaw-dropping, majestic, natural beauty. But if you're standing on the shoulder of that road alone, the profound silence feels less peaceful and, well, much more like a trap. And that physical reality, that trap, is the absolute foundation of our deep dive tonight. Because we are examining a grim, relentless timeline stretching across more than half a century.
Over 50 years, it's just staggering.
It really is. And the true horror begins with the discrepancy in the numbers. Like, along this specific wilderness corridor, the estimates of the missing and murdered, they just range wildly.
Right, depending on who you ask.
Exactly. You have an official police task force count of 18 victims. But if you look at the research from Indigenous organizations and local community groups, the number is estimated to be upwards of 40 to well over 80 individuals.
Wait, 80? That's a massive difference.
It's a huge gap. So our mission isn't just to look at the forensic evidence these killers left behind. We really have to examine the deeply entrenched systemic mechanisms that essentially built a perfect hunting ground, allowing predators to operate with absolute impunity for decades.
Right, because to understand how dozens of human beings could just vanish from the face of the earth, we have to look at the physical terrain first.
Right.
Because the highway itself is almost like an accomplice.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
I kept thinking of it like an oceanic trench. It's vast, it's silent, and it's capable of swallowing a person whole without causing even a single ripple on the surface.
And the forensic reality completely supports that visualization. From a purely investigative standpoint, the geography actively works against law enforcement.
How so? Beyond just being big?
Well, first, there is the isolation. Until incredibly recently, I'm talking late 2024, massive stretches of this wilderness were entirely devoid of cellular service.
Wait, 2024, so just recently?
Just recently, they finally got cell towers out there. So if your car broke down or if you were being followed, you could be stranded for hours without any way to call for help.
That is terrifying.
And second, you have the geological makeup. The terrain surrounding the pavement is characterized by incredibly sod-yielding soil. That makes concealing a crime, specifically, the rapid burial of human remains, tragically easy for a perpetrator.
Wow. And even if remains aren't deeply buried, nature just kind of takes its course.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you have an environment populated by bears, wolves, and, other carnivorous wildlife that will actively scatter and destroy forensic evidence in a matter of days.
Yeah, they just completely erase the scene.
So you have a place where someone can be taken in total silence, and the earth and the animals actively erase the traces of the crime. It is completely chilling.
It is.
And it's exactly why this road earned its moniker. During a vigil in Terrace, British Columbia, back in 1998, a woman named Florence Naziel coined a specific term for this stretch of asphalt.
Right, the Highway of Tears.
Yeah. She was looking at the families, envisioning them weeping over the endless, unresolved loss of their daughters, sisters, and mothers, and she called it the Highway of Tears.
It's just such a profound name. It really captures the agonizing generational sorrow of the whole region. And, the timeline shows us just how dangerous this oceanic trench really was.
When did it really start?
Well, because the environment was so remote and unforgiving, it didn't take long after the highway was fully paved and completed in 1969 for the trap to spring. The disappearances began almost instantly.
The terrifying part is the sheer velocity of it. We're talking about the very next year, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In October 1970, a 17-year-old girl named Helen Claire Frost vanished after leaving her home in downtown Prince George. Her sister immediately reported her missing, but she detailed feeling this overwhelming, chilling sense of inaction from the authorities.
Yeah, like nothing was really being done.
Right. The case essentially went nowhere. And then, almost exactly a year later, in October 1971, you have the disappearance of 18-year-old Ginny Samper.
And the Samper case is just a haunting example of how little time a predator needs on this road.
Tell me about that one, because the details are so eerie.
Yeah, so Ginny was waiting near a bridge on the highway while her cousin quickly biked off to grab a jacket. And the wilderness acoustics are really vital here.
How so?
Her cousin was riding away, right? And he heard a single metallic slam of a pickup truck door echoing in the distance. And by the time he turned around and rode back to where Ginny had been standing, she was completely gone.
Oh my God. Just a single slamming door in the dark.
Yeah.
That is the stuff of nightmares. You have a few seconds of opportunity and a life is just erased. And it just kept happening, right?
It really did. Like in 1974, a 14-year-old girl named Monica Ignas vanished while simply walking home in a snowstorm.
Wow. And, if you're listening to this, you might be asking yourself, how does someone just snatch a person in a matter of seconds? But the environment provides this perfect blinding cover for opportunists.
Well, and the opportunistic nature of these crimes is totally key. A predator needs enough visibility to spot a target, but enough isolation to take them without witnesses. Highway 16 provided hundreds of miles of exactly that.
Right.
But the pattern of these disappearances wasn't just defined by where they were happening. It was heavily dictated by who was out on that road.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Because the geography provided the cover, sure, but the victims were targeted because of highly specific manufactured vulnerabilities.
Let's look at the demographics of the victims, because the evidence points to a glaring reality that we have to impartially report here. A disproportionately high number of the missing and murdered on the Highway of Tears are Indigenous women.
Right, which really demands we ask the crucial question, why were so many Indigenous women out on this remote, incredibly dangerous highway in the first place?
Right, because predators don't just hunt in isolated places, they hunt for isolated people.
Exactly. The systemic drivers here are the actual mechanism of the tragedy. You had widespread, entrenched poverty in these rural northern communities, which meant personal vehicle ownership was remarkably low.
Not everyone had a car.
Very few did. And when you combine that with an almost total lack of municipal or provincial public transportation connecting these towns, you create a massive crisis of mobility.
Yeah, put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine you wake up and you desperately need to see a doctor. Or you have a shift at work you cannot afford to miss, or you simply want to visit your family in the next town over.
Right.
But you don't have a car, and there are literally 0 buses. What choice do you actually have?
None. You have no choice.
Exactly. You are forced to stick your thumb out on a dark, freezing highway with no cell service. They weren't hitchhiking for the thrill of it, They were hitchhiking out of absolute survival necessity.
And that necessity was engineered by decades of historical trauma, which the evidence thoroughly documents. We really have to look at the profound disruption of Indigenous family units and community structures through the Canadian Indian residential school system and the foster care system as well.
Right, those systemic failures.
Yeah. The mechanism of this vulnerability is very straightforward, honestly. When institutions forcibly separate children from their families and their culture over generations, it obliterates community safety nets.
So there's no one to lean on.
Exactly. When a young woman ages out of the system or tries to return to a fractured community, she often doesn't have an uncle to call for a ride. She doesn't have a familial safety net to fall back on.
Wow.
She is left transient, disconnected, and entirely reliant on strangers to navigate her world. When a society creates a marginalized group and then entirely fails to provide basic safety infrastructure, like just a simple bus route, it leaves them exposed on the shoulder of the road.
And because those systemic vulnerabilities were ignored year after year, the predators realized nobody was coming to stop them. They just kept hunting.
Yeah, they knew they could get away with it.
And the victim profiles began to expand over the decades in ways that are honestly genuinely hard to comprehend. Like, we've been talking about single women walking or hitchhiking, but in August 1989, an entire family disappeared.
Right, the Jack family. Ronald, his partner Doreen, and their 2 young boys, 9-year-old Russell and 4-year-old Ryan.
Wait, a family of 4? I mean, a single person hitchhiking is one thing, but how do 4 people, including 2 little kids, just vanish without a trace?
That's almost unthinkable.
The logs show they left their home heading to a logging camp where Ronald had been offered a job, right? and it included a daycare for the kids.
That's what he told his mother.
Ronald makes a phone call to his mother during the early morning hours of August 2nd, and then absolute silence. The family, along with their vehicle, completely drops off the map.
And the logistics of making 4 people vanish is just staggering. It highlights the sheer variety of danger on that corridor. Like, forensic analysts look closely at the variation in these cases.
Right, because it's not all the same.
Exactly. If you contrast the Jack family with the 1994 murder of 16-year-old Ramona Lisa Wilson, the differences are striking.
What happened with Ramona?
Well, she was hitchhiking to a dance. And when her remains were finally discovered in the woods nearly a year later, investigators found a bizarre, highly organized pile of items carefully placed nearby.
Like what kind of items?
It included interlocking nylon ties, a small piece of rope, and a pink water pistol.
Wow. Which indicates a completely different method of operation. I mean, the items left near Ramona feel ritualistic, highly specific, and sadistic. It's the hallmark of an organized, focused killer.
Absolutely.
But an entire family vanishing implies a totally different kind of predator.
Yeah.
Maybe someone with a large vehicle, or an entirely different motive like robbery or a personal dispute.
And that is exactly the point. When investigators synthesize the sheer variety of these victim profiles, the differing methods of operation, and the vastly different geographic locations of the remains, it becomes a mathematical and logistical impossibility to attribute all of these crimes to a single mastermind.
So it wasn't just one guy.
No, the Highway of Tears wasn't the hunting ground of one prolific serial killer. It was a corridor being utilized by a multitude of different killers who all independently realized the same thing. This road was a free-for-all.
Jeez. And if you're listening to this, you're probably screaming at your steering wheel right now asking, if you have dozens of missing women and multiple killers operating in the same area, where is the massive, immediate federal response?
Yeah, people always wonder that.
Because you hear this narrative of the tireless police investigation in true crime a lot. But when you dive into the actual source documents, the investigators on the ground were fighting a multi-front war. They were fighting the vast wilderness, yes, but they were also fighting their own government bureaucracy.
Oh, the institutional roadblocks were massive.
Right.
Like, in 2005, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched Project IPANA. It was a dedicated, provincially funded task force specifically designed to finally link these cases and determine the scope of the serial killer threat.
Right, so that sounds good on paper.
Initially, yeah. They took a robust approach, pulling in files from across the decades. But within a few years, Freedom of Information requests revealed a shocking administrative abandonment.
What happened?
The task force was completely gutted by budget cuts. It dropped from 70 dedicated officers down to just 12.
Wait, let that sink in. 12 officers to investigate dozens of murders across 700 kilometers of wilderness spanning 4 decades. That's essentially one officer for every 60 kilometers of highway, assuming they literally never sleep.
Yeah, the math doesn't work.
How does any jurisdiction justify cutting a task force hunting active serial killers by over 80%?
Well, the official cited reason was budget constraints. But advocates argue it speaks directly to whose lives are prioritized by the state. And that brings up the heavily documented accusations of systemic bias in how the cases were publicized.
Let's unpack that impartially because it's a huge part of the evidence.
Right. So dozens of Indigenous women had been vanishing since 1970 with relatively little national fanfare. But in 2002, a 24-year-old white tree planter named Nicole Hoare vanished on the highway.
And the reaction was different?
Completely different. Suddenly, the media and police attention skyrocketed. Her case generated massive national headlines, and it was actually a major catalyst for the eventual launch of Project IPANA.
It's a stark demographic reality of media coverage. Activists and families of the earlier victims pointed out that the disproportionate massive response to Nicole Hoare's disappearance proved that the resources did exist. They just hadn't been deployed for Indigenous victims. And the institutional failure went so far beyond just funding cuts or media bias, it reached the absolute upper echelons of the provincial government. We have to talk about the 2015 email scandal because this detail is just wild.
Yeah, this part is incredibly frustrating. The government of British Columbia had been holding high-level meetings specifically about the Highway of Tears and how to improve infrastructure to make it safer.
Okay.
So the political opposition filed a standard Freedom of Information request to see the records and communications from those meetings. In response, a ministerial assistant named George Greets explicitly ordered a staffer to delete them.
And he didn't just tell them to hit the crash can icon. He ordered them to triple delete the emails.
Yes, the triple delete.
This is vital to understand because it shows the sheer audacity of the cover-up. It's not just throwing a digital document in the trash. It's the equivalent of taking a paper document, running it through a shredder, burning the shreds, and then bribing the janitor to testify that there was never a document in the first place.
That's a great way to describe it.
You emptied the deleted folder, and then you manually override the system's backup server so that even forensic IT technicians can't retrieve it.
Yeah, it is an intentional, highly technical, multi-step process designed entirely to permanently destroy government records. Greets was ultimately convicted of lying to the privacy commissioner under oath about his actions.
Wow.
It was a blatant, calculated attempt to skirt transparency laws regarding the very transportation infrastructure that the community was literally begging for to protect these women.
So picture this. You have homicide detectives on the ground literally trying to dig clues out of the mud to catch multiple serial killers,
Right.
while the politicians above them are triple deleting files about highway safety to save face. It is infuriating.
It really is.
But despite that bureaucratic sabotage, despite budget cuts, and despite the wilderness actively eating the evidence, forensic science and sharp police intuition did eventually break through.
They did, and those breakthroughs proved the darkest theory to be true. The highway was crawling with different predators.
Who did they catch?
Well, law enforcement eventually caught and convicted seasoned serial killers like Edward Dennis Isaac and Brian Peter Arp, linking them to specific crimes along that corridor. But the arrest that fundamentally shifted the psychological profile of the Highway of Tears happened in 2010.
Right, the arrest of Cody Ledgerbukoff.
Yes.
It started with what seemed like a totally routine traffic stop. A wildlife officer notices a truck driving erratically on a remote logging road that shoots off the main highway. The officer pulls the truck over, walks up to the window, and discovers the driver, Ledgerbukoff, is covered in blood.
Just covered in it.
And a quick search reveals he is in possession of the belongings of a 15-year-old girl named Lauren Dawn Leslie.
And tragically, investigators found her remains shortly after, near where he was pulled over. Ledgerbukoff was arrested, tried, and ultimately convicted of 4 separate murders.
Unbelievable.
But what makes his case a profound anomaly in the study of criminology is his demographic profile.
Right, because he was only 20 years old at the time of his arrest.
Exactly. Only 20?
That completely shatters the psychological stereotype we have of serial killers. When you picture a man who has successfully hunted and killed 4 people, you picture an older, meticulous predator. Someone who has spent 20 or 30 years refining his methods to avoid capture. You do not picture a fresh-faced, seemingly normal 20-year-old kid.
No, not at all. His youth and his unremarkable appearance were his camouflage. He didn't look like the monster in the woods, he looked like a local kid.
Yeah.
But more importantly, his age proved that the violence on Highway 16 wasn't just a relic of the 1970s. Ledgerbukoff represented a brand new generation of predators who had realized they could utilize the exact same geographical and systemic vulnerabilities that killers used 40 years prior.
Because nothing had changed.
Right. The vulnerability of the victims hadn't changed, so a new wave of opportunists simply stepped in to exploit it.
That is deeply terrifying. To realize a 20-year-old could just seamlessly slide right into the violent history of this region. But what's even worse is the realization that capturing Ledgerbukoffs and Arp and Isaac, it didn't end the nightmare. Taking a handful of known monsters off the board didn't change the nature of the board itself. The unresolved cases just kept mounting.
Because the environment and the lack of infrastructure still existed. Consider the disappearance of Madison Scott in May 2011.
What happened with Madison?
She was 20 years old, attending a party at an isolated lake campsite off the highway. The next morning, her truck is still parked exactly where she left it. Her tent is still there, but it has been completely flattened.
Oh, yeah.
And all of her valuables, her purse, her keys are just left behind. But Madison is gone, and the wilderness kept her hidden for over a decade. Her remains weren't discovered until 12 agonizing years later.
Wow. Think about the weight of that for a second. You have a highway haunted by known convicted serial killers who've been permanently put behind bars, and yet their specific confessions and crimes still don't account for dozens of the missing people on those police boards.
It's true.
The authorities have had to publicly admit a very harsh reality. They may never solve all the Highway of Tears cases. In several instances, they have strong suspects, but without concrete forensic evidence, because the animals or the weather destroyed it, the files remain agonizingly open. Which begs the question, how many other predators are using that road tonight?
It is a chilling daily reality for the people who actually live in those communities. But, when we look at the legacy of Highway 16, we also have to look at the incredible resilience of those very same communities.
Yeah, let's talk about the families.
Because behind every single cold case file is a family that was abandoned by the system and forced to turn unimaginable, crippling grief into sustained, loud action.
Because they quickly realized no one else was coming to save them. They had to become their own shield. Like the family of Ramona Lisa Wilson, the 16-year-old girl whose remains were found with the nylon ties. They didn't just grieve in silence.
No, they didn't.
They started an annual memorial walk back in 1995 to force the public to remember her and all the missing women. And Indigenous groups have raised these beautiful, towering totem poles right along the edge of the highway to honor victims like Tamar Chipman, ensuring that every driver who passes by has to look at the human cost of this road.
Yeah, it's so powerful. And they didn't just build memorials, they actively fought for the systemic change the government was dragging its feet on.
What did they do?
In 2006, the communities banded together to produce a comprehensive recommendation report. They essentially did the government's job for them. They outlined exactly what was required to stop the violence: better social services, emergency cellular coverage, and most importantly, public transit. They demanded a safe way for their women to travel.
And the most tragic part of that advocacy is how long it took the state to listen. It took until 2017, nearly 50 years after the first young woman vanished, for a subsidized provincial bus service to finally begin operating along Highway 16.
50 years, it's just...
And even then, it was limited. But it finally gave vulnerable women a safe, warm alternative to sticking their thumb out in the dark.
The broader implication here is just a profound lesson in civic abandonment. When institutional protection failed entirely, when task forces were gutted and emails were deleted, the community had no choice but to fight for decades just to secure the basic transportation infrastructure that citizens in major cities take for granted every single day.
Which brings us to the true legacy of Highway 16 today. It is defined by an irreconcilable duality. You can drive it tomorrow, and you will be surrounded by some of the most jaw-dropping, pristine natural beauty on planet Earth. But beneath the surface, under the soft soil and behind the towering pines, it serves as a sprawling, 719-kilometer crime scene. It stands as a permanent monument to systemic failure.
It remains an oceanic trench. It swallowed people whole, not because it was haunted, but because the societal and geographic conditions were perfectly engineered to let predators thrive in the dark.
And that leaves us with a final thought I want you to mull over after this deep dive ends. We know that predators are entirely opportunistic. They hunt where it is easiest to get away with it. But if the specific vulnerabilities of these victims were created by a society's failure to provide basic infrastructure, care, and equal investigative attention, who ultimately bears the true responsibility for building the perfect hunting ground?
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to The Evidence Room. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for more true crime investigations from around the world. Remember, some cases remain unsolved, but the evidence always tells a story.